The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of Ruby's diner and cast soft stripes across the worn linoleum floor that had seen 40 years of footsteps and stories. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon hung in the air like an old familiar song. Harold Miller sat in his usual booth by the window with his weathered hands wrapped around a white ceramic mug. At 81 years old his frame was thinner than it used to be, but his eyes still held that clear steady gaze that came from a life lived with purpose. The Korean War veteran patch on his jacket was faded now, but he wore it every day without fail. Across from him sat his daughter Natasha, who had driven up from the city to have breakfast with her father like she did every Saturday morning. She was telling him about her grandchildren and how little Emma had learned to ride her bicycle without training wheels. Harold smiled and nodded and felt that warm glow that comes from knowing your family is happy and well. The diner was busy that morning with the usual Saturday crowd. Farmers in denim and flannel sat at the counter. A young couple shared pancakes in the corner booth. Ruby herself was behind the register with her reading glasses perched on her nose as she tallied up receipts. That's when the door swung open and 3 young men walked in. They were loud and rowdy with that aggressive swagger that comes from insecurity dressed up as confidence. Their voices carried across the diner and interrupted conversations. They slid into a booth near Harold and immediately started complaining about the service before anyone had even approached them. Ruby's waitress Jenny walked over with menus and a patient smile. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had worked at the diner for 15 years and knew how to handle all types. But these young men weren't interested in kindness. They made crude remarks and laughed too loud and seemed determined to make everyone around them uncomfortable. Harold tried to ignore them. He'd seen enough conflict in his life and had no interest in seeking out more. But when one of them stood up and deliberately knocked Jenny's tray from her hands, sending coffee cups crashing to the floor, Harold felt something stir in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had all those years ago when he'd put on a uniform to stand up for what was right. Jenny apologized even though it wasn't her fault and bent down to clean up the mess. The young man who'd knocked the tray just laughed and said something vulgar. His friends joined in. Harold set down his coffee cup slowly. His jaw tightened. Natasha put her hand on his arm and said quietly, "Dad, don't," because she knew that look. But sometimes a man reaches a point where staying silent feels like betrayal of everything he believes in. Harold stood up with his joints protesting after sitting too long, but his back straight and his shoulders squared. He walked over to the young men's booth and spoke in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of 8 decades. "Son," he said, "I think you owe the lady an apology." The young man who seemed to be the leader looked up at Harold with eyes that held no respect for age or experience or the simple dignity of human decency. He laughed and said something so disrespectful about veterans that the entire diner fell silent. Then he stood up and before anyone could react he slapped Harold across the face. The sound echoed in the sudden stillness. Harold stumbled back and caught himself on the edge of a table. His hand went to his cheek and for a moment he just stood there looking more sad than angry, as if wondering how the world had gotten to this place. Natasha rushed to her father's side. Ruby grabbed the phone to call the police. The other patrons sat frozen in shock, and the 3 young men laughed and headed toward the door as if they'd just done something clever. But they didn't make it outside. The door opened before they reached it and a man stepped through. His name was Marcus and he was Harold's son. He stood 6'2" with shoulders broadened by years of construction work and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of a life lived on his own terms. Behind him the doorway filled with more men. They wore leather vests with patches that identified them as members of a motorcycle club. Not the Hollywood version, but real men who worked real jobs and rode together on weekends and looked after their own. Marcus had been riding with his brothers that morning when he'd gotten a text from his sister saying she was having breakfast with Dad at Ruby's. He'd decided to stop in and surprise them. Instead he walked into a scene that made his blood run cold. He saw his father standing there with a red mark on his face. He saw the fear in his sister's eyes. And he saw 3 young men who clearly had no idea what they'd just done. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to his father and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You okay, Pop?" he asked quietly. Harold nodded, but Marcus could see the hurt in his eyes and it wasn't from the physical pain. Then Marcus turned to face the 3 young men. They'd stopped laughing now. They were looking at the doorway filled with leather and muscle, and suddenly their bravado had evaporated like morning dew. But Marcus didn't threaten them. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. Instead, he did something that took more strength than violence ever could. He spoke to them like human beings. "Do you know who you just hit?" Marcus asked in a voice that was quiet but filled every corner of the diner. "That's my father, Harold Miller. He's 81 years old. 70 years ago he was 19 and scared and thousands of miles from home fighting in a war so that people like you could grow up free and safe and have the right to be as stupid as you're being right now." The young men shifted uncomfortably. The leader tried to muster some defiance, but it crumbled under the weight of Marcus's steady gaze. "He's spent his whole life treating people with respect," Marcus continued. "He raised 4 kids by himself after my mother passed. He worked 2 jobs and never complained. He volunteers at the VA hospital every Tuesday and helps other veterans who are struggling. And you just slapped him because he asked you to apologize for being rude to a waitress." One of the young men looked down at his shoes. Another swallowed hard. The reality of what they'd done was starting to sink in. Marcus's brothers stood quietly behind him. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence was enough. But there was no menace in their stance. Just a solid wall of men who understood respect and loyalty and the quiet dignity of doing right by others. "Now you've got a choice," Marcus said. "You can be the kind of men who hit old veterans in diners. Or you can be the kind of men who make mistakes and own up to them and try to be better. Which is it going to be?" The silence stretched out. Ruby had put down the phone without calling the police. Everyone in the diner waited. Finally, the leader of the 3 young men stepped forward. His hands were shaking slightly and his voice cracked a little when he spoke, but he looked Harold in the eye and said, "Sir, I'm sorry. I was way out of line. There's no excuse for what I did." His 2 friends echoed the apology. They looked genuinely ashamed. Harold studied them for a long moment. Then he did something that nobody expected. He nodded and said, "Apology accepted. We all make mistakes, son. What matters is what we learn from them." Natasha squeezed her father's hand. Jenny the waitress had tears in her eyes. And Marcus felt that familiar pride in his father that he'd carried his whole life. The 3 young men left quietly. As they walked past Marcus, one of them paused and said, "Thank you for not beating the hell out of us." Marcus almost smiled. "Violence is easy," he said. "Decency takes work." After they'd gone, Ruby insisted that breakfast was on the house for everyone. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm of conversation and clinking silverware. Marcus and several of his brothers pulled up chairs around Harold's booth, and soon they were all laughing and telling stories. Harold sat in the middle of it all with his daughter on one side and his son on the other, and he felt grateful. Not just for the protection or the support, but for the reminder that kindness could still win. That respect still mattered. That doing the right thing even when it was hard still counted for something. As they were leaving, Marcus walked his father to Natasha's car. "Thanks, son," Harold said simply. "For what, Pop? You're the one who stood up. I just backed you up." "You did more than that," Harold said. "You gave those boys a chance to be better. That takes wisdom." Marcus shrugged. "I learned it from you." They embraced and Harold held on a little longer than usual. Then he got in the car and Natasha drove him home. That night Harold sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the fields beyond his house. He thought about the morning and about how quickly things could turn and how grateful he was for family and for the simple fact that respect and kindness still lived in the world even when it sometimes seemed buried under anger and division. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Just checking in, Pop. Love you." Harold smiled and typed back with careful, slow fingers. "Love you too, son. Proud of the man you are." And in that moment everything felt right with the world.